Just Branding. Podcast.
Hello, folks, and welcome to this latest episode of Just Branding. Today, we have, I hope, quite a fun and humorous session ahead of us. Well, maybe not. We'll find out. We'll explore together because we've got Paddy Gilmore with us. Who is Paddy? Well, Paddy runs a consultancy that specializes in helping brands use humor in their communications. He has reassured me that he is not a comedian. So if you've tuned in hoping for lots of kind of cracking jokes, we may disappoint you. This is obviously from a marketing side and a positioning side for brands. I've worked with Paddy on and off for the last 3 years on various projects, and I've always found him to be absolutely fantastic, adding that human touch to a brand's communications. Paddy has worked on some phenomenal brands in the past, including Harley-Davidson, Epson, Allied Irish Banks, and many, many more. So we'll put all that to one side because, frankly, we want to hear from you now, Paddy. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thank you.
So I've given a bit of an introduction, but give us a bit of a potted history. Where have you come from, and how have you got to this position of working with brands, particularly?
It kind of goes back about 25 years. Basically, I did a master's in history of art, and I was focusing on post-war conceptual art. So I was looking at people like Yoko Ono and these kind of artists. And a lot of these artists use humor in their artwork. And so while I was studying my master's, I looked into how they use humor and what humor is. And I discovered a lot about human mechanisms and the philosophy of humor and the politics of humor. And it just really interested me. And then somehow I found myself in advertising. I did advertising for about 20 years. And I was always trying to do funny ads because that was what I loved when I was a kid, when I was a teenager. And sometimes I would do them. And sometimes I would have bosses telling me, actually, we can't do that. No, we can't do that. And then about 3 or 4 years ago, I think there's a consultancy offering. And what I thought was all that knowledge I gained working in advertising, and all that knowledge I gained theoretically through my master's and all the reading I'd done, it all kind of came together. And I thought there's an offering here. And yeah, it's been going really well. So I work with clients around the world, with clients in Canada, Australia, America, all over Europe. And I do a lot of mixture of training, creative, and strategy. And yeah, it's going well.
I understand you've got a bit of a following in, is it Eastern Europe?
Eastern Europe, yeah. I don't quite know why or how, but Latvia. I was in Latvia twice last year. I've been there once this year. I'm going back next week. So for some reason, I'm big in the Baltics. I'm cool with it.
Paddy, how'd you go? Like, you missed a key spot, like swapping from history to like advertising. What happened?
Well, it was history of art. So I was looking at post-war art, essentially. So, the big figures were obviously Andy Warhol and, Laurent Rauschenberg and Damien Hirst and these kind of figures. And so that's what got me into advertising. But it was that humor thing that was always there. And it was the ads that I saw as a kid that I laughed at with the ads that I remembered and I remember now. So that was the kind of the key kind of through line, really.
So what was your first position in like the ad world?
Obviously, it's a very difficult industry to get into. I found myself as a junior copywriter at Bloomberg.
Okay.
And that was interesting first job because Mike Bloomberg himself was a former banker, and the company was very much set up like a bank. It was quite corporate. You worked long, hard hours. It was, a pretty intensive training ground, but I enjoyed it. It was fun. I learned the trade.
Brilliant. So let's kind of get into the subject, the meat of the subject now. So obviously humor, like how do you define humor, Paddy? Like what is it?
There's a number of different definitions. A very good one-sentence definition is humor as a form of social play. So essentially, in all civilizations around the world, there's not one civilization that's found to be without humor. It is universal and is a very human trait. Another definition, which I like, and which has become quite fashionable, is something called benign violation theory. And this is a theory that with humor, there's a violation of some sort. However, it's benign. And so once we realize it's benign, we realize there is humor there. So if you were to get in your car and to drive along the pavement, that would be a violation and it wouldn't be benign. Whereas if I tell you a joke, you can see a violation there. So if I say, for example, did you hear about the cargo ship carrying yo-yos? It sank 44 times. There's a violation there, you see. It's maybe not the best joke ever, but you can see the violation happening.
I like it, Paddy.
And it's benign. And that's what then kind of, gives it humor.
I've got one, Paddy. I've got one. Like, how many tickles does it take to make an octopus laugh?
I don't know.
10. 10 tickles.
Oh, very good, very good.
Okay,
very good.
all right.
Move on.
Okay, let's move on quickly.
Let's move on quickly. No, I think you're right. That's interesting about the violation because, one of the things that I always think is, helpful to me as a consultant is I like to think it's humor. But if you're trying to be funny or you're trying to do it, it's very hard. But the best thing I can the best way where I get a lot of laughs is when I'm self-deprecating, right? So that's where I find that's that violation you talk of. If you don't, my own personality, I don't take myself too seriously, and therefore I'm quite comfortable taking the mick out of myself, and that other people seem to laugh at that, which is frustrating. But particularly Jacob, for example, like he's laughing now. Look at him. So this is a thing. So it is that violation, but obviously in that context, there's a violation of self, but there's no real pain, so therefore it's funny. So,
exactly. Yeah. It's a very, very interesting area because up until the start of the 20th century, it really wasn't studied that much at all. And it wasn't studied for two reasons. The first reason was people didn't see it as being serious. It was seen as just being a bit of a laugh. And the second reason was people discovered that when you kind of lift the bonnet and really look into the nuts and bolts of humor, it's actually quite complex. It is a very, very complex area because it looks at cognitive thinking, emotions, psychology, politics, lots of different areas. And then the big change came because Sigmund Freud wrote a book about humor. And actually Freud was a huge influence. And then in the 70s and 80s, there was something called the positive psychology movement, which was the notion that rather than psychology looking at what was wrong with someone, psychology should actually look at what's healthy about people. And so they started to think, well, maybe having a good sense of humor was indicative of a positive psychology, of a healthy psychology. And that got a lot more interest. And now as an academic area, it's flourishing. There's a lot more interest in it. Some fascinating thinkers, some fascinating papers coming out. So it's really interesting.
So let's shift it into the realm of sort of brand building. I guess the biggest question is well, why should a brand consider humor serious? This is going to sound wrong. Why should a brand consider humor seriously as a technique to use in their communications?
Basically, there are three core reasons. First is that it makes people warm to the campaign, the advertising campaign that is being broadcast. The second one is it makes people warm to the brand. And the third reason is possibly the most important reason for any business, which is it makes people more likely to buy the product or service being sold. So this is what gives humor its power. So when people dismiss it, these are typically the kind of things that I'll say in response. 91% of people say they're more likely to remember a funny ad, which means it's really, really strong. 72% of people say they would choose a funny product, a funny ad over a rival product that wasn't using a funny ad. So there's a lot of evidence to suggest that this is really, really useful. And it's on this evidence that I've based my consultancy and my work.
Yeah. So I often think that, you mentioned Bloomberg earlier, but, imagine quite a sort of a traditional brand offering a traditional kind of service. Often I find humor is a great way, if they inject that into their communications to stand out, right? To be different in a serious, stale, dusty category, add a bit of humor in. Like I'm thinking, like, for example, if we're going with banking, like I know Monzo, for example, when they came on the scene, they completely blew everybody away with their kind of witty communications and where they injected them in the customer journey. And so I think that perhaps I would add another, fourth one on there. I don't know what your thoughts are on that in terms of distinction. Like, what are your thoughts about using humor to distinguish a brand?
Definitely. It makes things a lot more distinctive, especially if a brand is selling a commodity. So a great example of this is American insurance brands. So if they're selling car insurance home insurance. Essentially, we don't really want to think about it. We just want a good deal. And we want to know that if, God forbid, something goes wrong, they're going to be there for us. And then you've got brands like Geico, who use humor a lot in their adverts, and they use it really effectively. Their ads have become fantastic because what they're doing is they're saying, right, it's a dull subject. Let's use humor to get it into people's living rooms, get it into people's heads, and get our name, as a solid brand, within people's heads.
Yeah, absolutely. One that comes to my mind is Specsavers, right? So, should have gone to Specsavers. I mean, that is a line and a half, right? When you put it in the context of the campaign. So for the global audience out there, Specsavers that sells glasses, contact lenses, and I think they even sell hearing aids nowadays. But the ads often depict somebody making a terrible mistake, right? Quite humorously. And the tagline is "should have gone to Specsavers," right? So it's quite an interesting positioning from their perspective and they've cleaned up, recently, Specsavers on our high streets, at least in the UK. So yeah, I completely agree with you. I think it's a great way of adding that human element to any communications, even in quite a stale sector like buying glasses, but commodity-based stuff, yeah, 100%.
I was going to ask about the opposite end of it, right? Like if you thought about categories that often use humor, like think about beer, for example, like there's a lot of men's humor in it. What's your point of view on, if every brand is using humor?
This is an interesting point because up until a few decades ago, there was this idea that humor could only be used by small luxuries, if you like. So beer, sweets, cigarettes, these kind of things, basically low priced, treats, if you like. But then as time's gone on, humor has been used with more luxury brands. Harvey Nichols have used humor extensively. And it's also been used with brands that are selling quite high value items. So Volkswagen uses humor a lot. Now your typical Volkswagen is going to cost you, I don't know, $20, $30, $40,000. So this is where over the past few years, there's been a lot more exploration as to where and how it can work. I think the only one area which humor isn't used and isn't really going to be used in future are high expense, high risk products. So if you run a skydiving business, you're probably not going to use humor there. However, there aren't too many skydiving businesses out there in comparison to other businesses. So the potential in using humor is still vast.
Okay, so let's we've touched on why brands should really use humor. I guess the next question is, well, how? You've mentioned, obviously high risk situations, not and high value, not a great way to use it. But how would a brand begin to use it? Let's imagine we got a startup before us and we're talking to the startup company. Like, when should they use it and how should they use it? How do you sort of recommend brands start to?
What I do whenever I'm speaking to a company, so I talk about something called human mechanisms. So there are basically three core mechanisms, and these are the ways that humor is created. And so what I do with that company is find out what kind of mechanisms work best with them. Now, sometimes it's a case that two or all three might work together. It's a bit like a good analogy. It's like the periodic table of elements. Some elements stand alone, and some elements join up with other ones. So what I tend to do is I go through these mechanisms. I'll give you an example of this. If you take the famous tango ads, when you've been tangoed. So their form of humor is called supremacy humor. We laugh because someone else is the butt of the joke. There's that guy there, this naked man, well, I don't know, naked orange man hitting people around the face. Now, someone else is the butt of a joke, so that's supremacy humor. That's a specific type of humor. That might well work for a certain brand. It might not work for another one. So what I do is I go through all the different options on the table and then say which would work best with your audience, your brand, and your proposition. And that's typically the starting point. And then from there, we can start looking into different styles, different examples of brands that have used a similar type of humor. Take it from there.
How many types of humor are there? Like you're saying you lay different types of humor on the table. Are you explaining each of these to the client, or can you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so we basically have three core human mechanisms. They kind of branch out into different kind of points. So that then turns into five. Okay, so that's the mechanism. And then you have Added onto that, you have humor styles, which is from psychology, and that then kind of comes into this. This might seem, I'm not trying to blind you with science, but this is essentially the building blocks of humor. One of the things which I, in a way, steer away from is talking about it as comedy. It's not about getting a cheap laugh or a quick laugh. It's about doing it thoroughly. So when I'm working with a brand, they can really understand what these mechanisms are, how they work, and the best type of mechanism for them.
Okay. So I'm so curious now. You mentioned one like supremacy, but what are the other ones? I've got enough time to go through
Supremacy.
them?
Yeah, by the way. So there's supremacy humor, which is basically when someone else falls on a banana skin. Okay. So someone else is the butt of the joke, and you feel great because you're superior. Okay. Then the next one is incongruity resolution, which is there's an incongruity and that's resolved. Okay. So a good example of that is the joke I said earlier. So, do you hear about the cargo ship carrying yo-yos? It sank 44 times. It's incongruous, but we resolve it in our mind. Okay. So Volkswagen use a lot of incongruity resolution in their ads. And the third type of humor is called arousal safety. And that is typically when we witness something quite taboo and we laugh. It's almost like a kind of nervous laugh. It's like a release. Sigmund Freud, as you might imagine, was very much into this type of humor. To him, that was the sole source of all the humor. But it's not. But it's a very, very powerful form of humor. A good way of talking about that is often like gross out humor, that kind of thing. So those are the three core building blocks. And then these move in different ways and they kind of bond with other ones in different ways. Sorry, I just mumbled there slightly.
No. I'm just like I'm reading the next steps, and I was like, well, my thoughts is like, well, how do you apply this to a brand? Like, what are your steps that you take them through for copy? I guess would be the first part, I assume.
Yeah, well, what I do is I talk to them about their audience, their previous advertising, their proposition, their brand, and I show them examples. So The Economist is a good example of supremacy humor. Volkswagen use incongruity resolution. Pampers use arousal safety, arousal relief. So I will go through lots of different examples. And it's basically a question of, okay, what sits best for you? One of the things I always find with presentations is companies, pretty much always, are really surprised at the range of humor out there. That's the kind of eye-opening moment, the jaw-drop moment, because they realize, wow, there is so much more to this than we thought. And there are so many different ways of being humorous, and this is what I try and show them. And it's like a sweet shop. And then they find out which one works best for them.
I love that, Paddy. I really love that. I think the thing for me is what you've said, and we're massive advocates, as you can imagine, of like strategic approaches to brand building. And what you've said is, look, you've got to understand your audience first. You've got to understand the way you're going to position your brand in front of that audience. And once those two things are understood, the value the audience is going to hopefully have in the brand and its proposition, then you can work out, okay, let's explore humor to see whether that's a great way of communicating to the audience. And so it seems to me like if you can create a scenario whereby your audience understand the joke, and it positions the brand in the midst of that, you're on to a winner, aren't you?
I think so. Definitely, yeah. I mean, the alternative approach is that an advertising agency or a brand, they basically audit their audience and they discover, for example, that their audience like Schitt's Creek or Ted Lasso. So they do it by their media diet. And they then think, okay, on the basis of that, we need to have similar kind of humor to Ted Lasso. The problem is, though, that doesn't help a team of creatives in an advertising agency. They're like, well, what do they do? What do they do with that? So what I try and do is to really get down to the building blocks. I show them lots of examples of advertising and marketing communications, and this means they can really get a good overview of the entire field.
And you're fantastic at that, Paddy. I've worked alongside you, as you say. And in terms of like Paddy and I, just for the audience's perspective, we've run training together, based on usually a strategic approach, which I've headed up, and then Paddy's taken that on. And just splitting it up into, as you call it, the building blocks, I think is phenomenal. I was going to ask you about that in terms of humor and brand, tone of voice guidelines. What's your kind of perspective on that? Because I know you can and you have in the past crafted tone of voice. Have you found it a way of pulling the humor and the principles of the humor into that? And what's your experience has been like with that?
I think so. I think that, typically humor, if a brand wants to integrate it as part of their tone of voice, they can. But normally there would be, two, three, or four other pillars of tone of voice to go along with that. So my concern there would be, okay, how does humor dovetail with those? How does it either gel with them or how does it contrast against them? So typically that's what I would do in that scenario. But sometimes a brand will come along to me and say, we want to use humor. We haven't got anything in our brand book about how we should use it. Can you write our kind of humor brand strategy? And that's what I then go to. So it's quite a kind of a separate thing there.
All right, let's dive into that. So how do you develop copy, Paddy, that is humorous?
Well, in a way, this goes back to looking at mechanisms to finding out what type of humor is best for that brand. So rather than being prescriptive, saying, okay, you do A, B, C, D, E, we look at lots and lots of examples. And then we decide the kind of humor, type that we're going to use. And then what we do is we then look at different kind of tactics within that. So it could be understatement, it could be exaggeration, it could be irony, deprecation. There's lots of different tools, if you like, from there. And we then kind of pinpoint it down and see what works best. To give you an example of this, The Economist, the famous Economist White Out of Red campaign, their humor type was satire and deprecation was their main tactic. Okay, so you have a phenomenal campaign. I think it went up 60, readership of the magazine went up 64%, whilst the actual industry was shrinking, but it actually soared. And it shows the effectiveness of a really good humor-based campaign.
I remember one of those ads. It's brilliant. It says something like, there's like a big quote mark in as you see in the red background, white text. It says, "I never read The Economist."
Yes.
And
yeah.
underneath, in very small, it says, "management trainee, aged like 42 or something."
That's it.
It's so brilliant. It's like, well, why are they still a management trainee, age 42?
Exactly.
Get it now.
Exactly.
Brilliant, absolutely genius whoever came up with that. So brilliant. Okay, so let's. I guess it can also be quite a risque kind of area, which I imagine is why a lot of brands, instinctively shy away from taking it that seriously. I guess they worry that there's a high risk of upsetting or potentially offending somebody or a part of their audience. What are your thoughts on kind of common pitfalls, and is that one of them?
Yeah, it's interesting. I read a study recently that said that 95% of senior management fear using humor in their communications.
They don't have a sense of humor, do they?
There is a strong sense of fear. There is a strong sense of fear. What I do is as I was saying earlier, I talk about human mechanisms and we look at the building blocks. Now, for each mechanisms, there are safeguards. And so what I then do is say, right, these are the safeguards you should use if you're using these type of mechanisms, or this mechanism or these types of mechanisms. A good analogy, I think, is it's a bit like if you're going skiing and going cycling and going skateboarding, you'll wear a different type of helmet for each activity. And so it's a similar kind of thing with humor. Whichever type of humor you decide to use, you need different types of safeguards to go along with it. So what I do is I talk about these, and frequently just in talking about it, we find the fears coming through and we can then address them. It is a huge area and it's something that I find myself often talking to brands about. But I can understand that if it's, a massive multi-million dollar campaign, they want it to do well. I can completely, empathize with that.
Mm-hmm. I often find, don't you think? I don't know if this is, it's often in the areas where people are scared to go, right? That's where the greatest success will lie. Because if 80% of the other, senior leaders in your competition companies or brands are thinking the same as you, like, oh, that's quite risky, they won't go there. And it's those brave kind of, audacious risk takers that will that will say, okay, I understand the logic, I understand the strategy here, I understand, with as much audience testing as is feasible, that this should be successful. Let's go for it, And I think that's what we need more of, brave brand leaders.
Exactly. And also, humor science is so advanced now. We've got a very, very good knowledge of how a brand can use it safely. So this is where, our knowledge is such that we've got everything going for us as brands. And so it's a very good time for a brand to be thinking about using humor seriously, because the safeguards are there, and a lot of what I'm doing is communicating them.
So if a CEO or marketing exec would say like, oh, humor's not really on brand for us, what would you be saying to them, or would you be asking?
I always find that phrase on brand a little bit of a funny one. And what I would typically do is politely answer that. I'd say, well, is it on campaign? Because typically a brand will use humor in their campaigns, which is, to me, there's like a slight separation there. A lot of what humor is about is performance. And it's about performing in a way that people, warm to the product. And a great example of this is if you take Queen, Bohemian Rhapsody is a great product, a great song. But without Freddie Mercury's incredible performance, it wouldn't have been what it is, which is a great achievement. And so this is where I would kind of politely kick against that.
It's interesting, Paddy, that you distinguish, from campaign, from brand, I guess, in a way, because one area I see a massive opportunity for brands to really express themselves and gain more loyalty is in customer experience, right? So I mentioned Monzo earlier. They used to, like, if they noticed someone who bought a little treat for themselves or something, they'd ping them, on their iPhone or whatever, little message would pop up saying they enjoy the ice cream or something,
Sure.
Fun stuff. So the point I'm trying to make is that a lot of the time I find there's a huge opportunity for brands to distinguish themselves through the way that customers experience their product or service. And so whilst I completely understand what you're saying around separating campaign, which is obviously usually around a specific product launch or something, you're trying to generate leads or generate sales in a particular way, I want to encourage all the brand leaders listening in to think about wider as well. Like, try it in a campaign. If it starts working, right? Why wouldn't you explore other areas of your brand?
Exactly. I mean, there's a lot of potential there, and it's not solely devoted to the campaign at all. I mean, a great example of this is on Virgin Railways or Virgin Rail, where the salt and pepper cruet have printed underneath "stolen from Virgin Rail." So there's a sense that they're using humor there, with their product. It is a wonderful, wonderful thing to encounter because it just shows so much warmth and humanity. It's great.
Particularly in stale sectors. Like, I think it's such a great thing to inject in. Okay, well, look, let's kind of get some tips from you then, Paddy. Like, what would your top tips be? Let's say we've got someone there, they're like, right, I want to use some of this humor, what Paddy's on about. How do I begin to kind of do it? Give us some tips for using it.
Okay, the first thing I would say is, put your fears and misconceptions to one side. It is not about cheap laughs. It is not about a belly laugh, anything like that. It is a very useful tool to use when building a brand. That's the first thing. The second thing, I think, I mentioned this a bit earlier, but I'd say separate comedy and humor. Yes, there's a vast amount of humor in comedy, but, when we're looking at humor in an advert, it's quite a distinct thing, or marketing communication or with a brand. And the third thing I'll say is really research it, really talk to your audience, get a sense of your audience, get a sense of what kind of things they're like, what they're like, where your brand is, and things like that. Those are the kind of the three starting tips I'd give.
Okay, right. I guess final thing is to figure out, well, how do folks get in touch with you if they wanted to?
Thank you.
I know you've got a great newsletter that goes out pretty much every week, if I've got that route right. But how do people kind of connect with you and get more of this humor stuff?
Sure. Thank you. Well, my website is studiogilmore.com, and that's all one word, and it's GILMORE.com. And my Substack is called Brands and Humor, and I think that's brandsandhumor.substack.com, I think. And it's humor with a U because the Americans spell it without a U. So that goes out every week.
you know, those Americans, what can I say?
Not very considerate, really, is it? It's not very considerate.
Not right. It's just not right. You know, the language, what they've done to the English language, I do not know. But anyway, there we are. Jacob, any final points from you?
This is brilliant. It was, very insightful. So thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, Paddy.
Thank you, Jacob. Thanks very much.